Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome as we continue with this celebration of Pulse 2021, where we have been discussing all things with 2020 foresight. My name is Torrie Harris, and I have the pleasure and the honor of moderating our Women in Entertainment panel. We are approaching the tail end of Black History Month and are on the cusp of Women's History Month. And in honor of both, it was only fitting to have this discussion with our esteemed panelists today and take a deep dive into the mind of some of the top female leaders in the industry. Just a little about me. I'm an attorney by trade and currently pursuing my executive MBA at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. I'm an East Coast girl by birth and by heart and relocated to the Los Angeles area to pursue my own passion in the entertainment industry. So I, like you all, am here today to learn more about our guest. So our panel today, we have first Miss Ashley McFarlin Buie, an alum of Howard University in Washington, D.C. She's currently Vice President of Development at WeTV. As Vice President, Ashley oversees new and developing projects for the network and serves as an executive producer on popular series. With over 20 years in the industry, she's garnered a strong reputation and even founded her own company, Bird's Eye Entertainment. Welcome, Ashley. So
Hi.
Next, I want to introduce you all to my fellow Anders sisters. Starting off, we have Ms. Martha Saucedo. Martha is responsible for leading AEG's external affairs, developing the organization's priorities with respect to local communities. In addition, she oversees AEG's philanthropic initiatives, as well as AEG's Community Foundation. Welcome, Martha. My next Anders sister is Ms. Bernetta Hardy. Bernetta is a California licensed attorney, my fellow JD Legal Eagle, within the Business and Legal Affairs Department of Viacom CBS. Bernetta is responsible for the structuring and the negotiation of contract arrangements for digital, new media, live events, and unscripted television programming. Welcome, Bernetta. And finally, my last Ender sister, we have Ms. Ryann Lauckner. Ryann is President and Chief Strategy Officer at Asylum Entertainment Group. Asylum is an LA-based entertainment production group focused on founding and funding creative companies and partnerships across the spectrum. Welcome, Ryann, and welcome again to all you ladies. So, I had a brief introduction about you all. But let's get started with how you traverse through this moment and to this panel. And so I always firmly believe that aside from one's name, a person's story is the most unique and special aspect of who they are. And so it's important for our audience to really understand your journey. Let's talk about how each of you found your way into the entertainment industry. What was your journey and how did it culminate in your current role? I'm going to start with Ashley.
Oh, hi. Well, not that that's a heavy question at all. I'm an 80s baby. I was born in 1980, and around that time, television was raising quite a few of the latchkey kids in my neighborhood. So I like to say I got into television by way of a viewer. As a child, I was enthralled and fascinated by what I saw coming out of that little box, all the light coming out of there, and all the stories and the characters and the people that were inside that box really drew me in. And I was fortunate enough to work early as a teen almost in television because my mom was a producer, and I was introduced to the world of television and film very early. As a child, I was holding up old school cue cards. So I was fascinated to know that there were real people behind the magic of that television box. And I was determined to be a part of the team behind the scenes to make these stories come alive for little girls and boys like myself.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to get back to that passion and to that vision of making stories come alive. I'm going to turn next to Martha. Martha, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Hi, Torrie. Thank you for hosting today. So I'm a native Angelino. I grew up going to Dodger games and watching the Lakers on TV. And so the work that I do is in live entertainment, predominantly in professional sports and live music. And I was a poli-sci major at UCLA as an undergrad, so I have a really sort of unconventional story in that I worked for an elected official right after I graduated. He was then Congressman Javier Becerra. He is Biden's nominee for Health and Human Services Secretary and undergoing hearings today, I think. But after spending 3 years in his district office, I felt like I had exhausted the opportunities there, which I always sort of share with people. as a way to say, like, do everything you can in the job that you're in, but when you do feel like you've exhausted sort of those opportunities, think about what your next step is. And I transitioned into the private sector. I worked for Mattel, the toy company, and probably just after a year of being at Mattel, I was recruited by AEG, which was then really a startup. We're an international company now, but that opportunity afforded me the ability to really grow with the company because I joined it as a startup essentially. And so I've been with them for 19 years, and there's a whole group of us that were able to really grow and develop while we were there. And I think the thing I love most about it is that my product is creating memories for people, primarily like, people going to sporting events or people experiencing live music together. And so that's really the best part of my job.
I love that, creating memories for people and understanding and recognizing when you have to pivot. And that's an awesome, awesome story. So I'm going to turn next to Bernetta. Miss Bernetta.
Oh, hi, Torrie. Thank you again for hosting. So my journey was a little all over the place. So I went to law school. I think like you, also like a Black woman, I wanted to be Thurgood Marshall. I wanted to be a civil rights attorney and just conquer the world. He's a god in our race. But I quickly learned I didn't have the emotional capacity, frankly, to be a civil rights attorney. So I went to my counselor in law school, and she told me, why don't you try entertainment? So then I applied for like a million internships, and I finally landed one at NBC. And that summer I worked at NBC, and it felt like home. I just knew this is what I really wanted to do with my life. And I just like, that was my passion. But I knew that I had no connections and I looked like this. So I knew I had some challenges ahead. So I focused on getting a job right after law school. And after law school, I humbled myself and I worked as a paralegal at E Entertainment at that time. I worked there for years, worked really, really hard. And eventually I was promoted to manager. At that time, also, E was acquired by NBC. So I was there for about 5 years, and I realized that I really wanted to be an attorney position, not a legal staff position. So then I had to transition over to a production company, and it was a good experience because I really learned how to, handle really close deals, and really handle deals with less leverage and different resources. So it was a really good experience as well. But after a while, I had a mentor who told me I need to work in a law firm. Like he's like, you have to be a lawyer, you need to work in a law firm and get that experience. So then I went to a law firm and I really got that experience, and I understood why it was important to really fine tune those nuances of being, a really talented lawyer. But after that, I really wanted to be in-house again. I really love being an in-house counsel. So then I went to did a term at Korn Ferry as corporate counsel, and there I applied to UCLA Anderson program, and then I was poached to go to Viacom CBS. And at Viacom CBS, I'm in the business of legal affairs and business affairs executive. I primarily negotiate and draft agreements for live events, digital, new media, but overall I advise my clients, and I just really help support their business initiatives in general. So it's been a great ride.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Bernetta and I met on one of our introductory stats courses, and that was quite an experience. So I'm glad to have you here and that we survived. So I'm going to turn now to Miss Ryann Lauckner. Ryann, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thank you, Torrie. And the fact that we're all here means that we all made it through stats, even though that was questionable at one point. So I came out to Los Angeles to go to USC Film School. So it probably sounds like I have been on the entertainment track for a long time. And I'm getting old, so it actually has been a long time. But I actually I hadn't thought about going into entertainment at all until I was a junior in high school. I was an Army brat, and I always thought I was going to be a lawyer. But I started writing screenplays in high school, and a friend of mine who was studying to go to Juilliard read them and said, I think that maybe you want to go into film school instead. And, if it doesn't work out, then, you can always be a lawyer. So why don't you just kind of roll the dice and see what happens? I hear USC has a good film school, so maybe try that one. So I sort of applied on a whim. And when I got in, it felt like, they had 1,000 odd applications and only chose 50 kids. And so it just seemed like, well, this is what I have to do. I was really fortunate in that I showed up at USC, and the very first day they said, who here wants to be a director? And 49 hands shot up. And then they said, who wants to be a producer? And one hand, mine, shot up. And as a result, I produced just about everybody's film at USC because I was the only one who actually wanted to be on that track from the very beginning, mainly because those of you who know me know that I have an opinion or two. And I learned early on that the producers were allowed to have the opinions, the only ones on set who were allowed to have opinions other than and directors. At least a very old version of Hollywood sort of subscribed to that mentality. What I really learned in film school, though, was that film was way too slow for me. So I was really determined to be in television. When I graduated, I needed to get a job immediately, or I'd basically be trying to get into film and television from El Paso, Texas, which is where my hometown was at the time. No surprise, there are actually not very many opportunities at all in El Paso, Texas in film or television. And so I responded to every ad I could find. Back then, Craigslist was a very big thing. And kind of falling backwards through a weird Craigslist ad, I ended up being a production assistant in post-production on a show called Big Brother. So that was my very first job. I want to echo something that Martha said, which was kind of like when you're in those positions and you get opportunities, really, really exploit them to their fullest. Because in the course of a few months, I went from being a production assistant to a post-production coordinator, and really sort of learned what it was to be an AP and hustled. And I probably got my next 2 years worth of jobs through that route. Early in my career, I worked in post-production, I worked in physical production, and then I went into the creative producing route. And that's really where I spent most of my time. I moved up the ranks until I was a showrunner. I did mainly competition reality. The showrunning piece kind of got into docuseries where we were able to follow real life journeys, which was really important to me because I've been an avid people watcher my entire life. But when the executive piece happened, it was sort of by accident. I was offered the job. It was sold to me as a job where I will never be bored again. And I generally take any opportunity to not be bored. So I signed up without doing a lot of diligence. I don't know that I would recommend that, but I've been an executive now for 8 years and have gone through acquisitions. In 2018, we actually bought our company back from our parent company, and I helped to architect the business model that we now run, which is, as Torrie mentioned in the beginning, a production group concept where we co-fund companies with emerging creators. So that is what I spend a lot of my time doing now. And it was a very unconventional journey, but I wouldn't change even one piece of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryann. And we did survive stats, and you all have survived your journey, and we are here again in this moment. And so your stories are so special and so unique. And I want to thank you for sharing that with our audience. Your stories are also full of moments of growth and pivots, as Martha alluded to, and even Ryann. Here at Anderson, in our Leadership Foundations course, during what's called the Leadership Foundations Week, we were introduced to that concept of a signature style. And sometimes it can take a while to determine and define that style through your entire journey. So given the journey that you've just shared, I'm curious as to how you would define your signature leadership style, and two, what was that pivotal aha moment in your journey when you resolved, this is who I want to be as a leader? I'm going to go reverse order, and I'm going to start back to you, Ryann.
Hot seat. Okay. Well, before I get into the sort of pivotal moment, I think, what I would say is that my leadership style probably is something pretty close to servant leadership. I really believe in that style. I don't know that it's appropriate for every industry or every company, but working in a creative industry where there is no shortage of vision or ego, I think that what a lot of projects and a lot of companies sort of miss on is how there needs to be someone who's really working in service of aligning those interests and making sure that creative stakeholders really do feel like they're represented. We work very often through partnerships, whether that's with the creators who we co-found companies with, or if it's with third-party producers who come in and basically say, I have the show I'm really passionate about, can you help me get it set up? And we want to make sure that we don't then sideline them and kind of cut them out of that process, which is actually not an atypical experience in our line of work. So I spend a lot of time, most of my time, making sure that we keep those interests on the front burner, and that our employees are working in an environment that they feel is equitable and sustainable for them. We handle a lot of volume, and we handle it with a lot of there's a lot of variability in it. And so it's really easy to get to a critical point where, in pursuit of a goal, you're kind of pushing past everyone, how people are feeling, and forgetting to check in. So I spend a lot of my time doing that, and it's a big part of my leadership. I wish I could say that I'd always been that kind of leader, but the truth is, I didn't. As I mentioned, I didn't know what an executive was when I became one. And as a result, I was kind of just continued being a creative producer in a higher level role for a production company. And what that meant was I basically tried to do everybody else's job for them, which is not a leadership style I would recommend. And I think was really the reflection of me just being very young in that job. And so I wish would spend some time doing some amends for some of the showrunners who had to tolerate me early in my career. I think that the moment that really changed that for me was when we did a really big show in South Africa. And I was down there with 300 different crew members on the South Africa side. We had about 50 of them were flown in from the UK. I was the only American. We'd flown in one director from Mexico. There were 3 of them. And it became really obvious to me what the job was in that moment, the need to really take a step back from my own idea of, vision and what it should be, and to instead try to be the best executive, championing the best ideas in every moment, and being really clear about what the expectations were and what the rubric was for having the best idea. So a lot really shifted for me in that moment. It was also just coincidentally in 2016 when Trump was elected. I was in South Africa, and a lot of things got pulled into perspective right at that moment for me, potentially as a result.
I think it brought into focus for a lot of people as well. I love the concept of being a servant leader. I try to mimic my leadership style in the same vein. It takes a lot of growth. It takes a lot of humility, and it is a compassionate style. And so it's refreshing to hear other people in the industry and in leadership roles espouse to that type of leadership. So thank you for sharing that. Bernetta, tell us about your signature style and your aha moment.
So thank you. So my signature style, I would say, is compassionate, collaborative, but directive style. So I'm definitely compassionate towards people that I'm working with and also my clients and their needs. And I believe collaboration is the best way to get the best results, and really diversity of opinions. It really gives the best problem solving. But I find that in my field, there's a variety of different levels of staff that you're dealing with on your team, like my team. So really having a clear directive as regarding results, regarding vision, regarding expectations is really important. So while I am understanding and I try to collaborate is important, I really value results. I value standards. I'm a stickler for them. And at times I will be firm just to make sure things are actually getting done. So I make no qualms about that. Just the nature of my business, it kind of leads to someone has to be the leader at sometimes and has to be a little bit firm. And I'm comfortable with that when needed to be. With regards to my moment, I would say when I was at a production company, it was quite a shock. So I went from, NBC with all these resources and all these different lawyers there to having my direct boss being this wonderful woman who's an EVP and having one senior attorney. And so there was an incident at one time with the production, and we had a very difficult show. A show was just very difficult, legally just difficult in many ways, but it was sold to a network and it had to happen. And a lot of things were going wrong, and everyone was kind of coming towards me like we need answers. And it was a situation in which production made a huge mistake. And with this because lack of clarity, really, it wasn't all their fault. It was just lack of understanding, and it threatened their network. So I really decided at that moment I was going to listen, and I was going to not really focus on blame, but really listen to everyone, listen to my clients, listen to everyone's concerns, try to find the real issue and really problem solve it, and really try to solve the overall issue of keeping the show going and keeping our staff moving forward and keeping our clients happy as well. Me and my boss at that time, and also the owners. So that was my moment when I felt like I had to step up because there was no one else there, frankly, but I had to choose how I was going to remedy this problem. And I feel like that was my moment when I decided I wanted to be an approachable, but effective, directive, authority figure. That's my moment.
That's a beautiful moment. I do want to have a follow-up with that. What was the reaction to that compassion that you wanted to demonstrate as a leader?
It was welcomed, I think, because they knew that it was a very alarming situation, and we were threatening our source of the Prodco. We sell shows to the networks, right, at that time. So their livelihood was the show, was the network buying the show and doing what they said. So they really felt that they were going to get yelled at and screamed at, and the business owners were going to fire everyone. So I think they were really a little taken aback that I was more calm and more like, information seeking and really trying to understand their perspective. And I felt, to me, it opened up credibility and opened up trust, so I could really understand what truly happened. You know what I mean? So I could really understand really, really what was the lack of communication, what was the source. So I find that when you approach even a problem, alarming problem, with just listening and compassion, the guards go down and you get the real issue, and you can problem solve a lot faster, and people feel heard. So that was I think their reaction helped foster my belief that this was the best style for me in terms of leadership. Thanks for the question.
That's that is wonderful to hear, to be heard, and to be felt to be heard. That is the epitome of what a leader should aspire to do with its followers. So thank you for sharing that. Martha, you have grown with your company, AEG. You've had a number of pivots before that, but you have really grown, as you said, in the startup phase to now. What was your leadership style, your signature style, and that aha moment for you?
I think there's three big characteristics of my leadership style. The first is that I lead by example. So I really try to exemplify the behavior that I want to see in my teams. The second is that I use my expertise to further the goals of the company and not myself. I think we live in an environment where there's a lot of emphasis on sort of self-promotion, and I think there's definitely a place for that. But I think where I've really been able to advance, it's been in moments where I've really focused on how do I further the business goals of this organization? How do I add value to the business? And then the last characteristic I would say is I really try to emphasize some basic qualities that are important to me, like respect for others, personal integrity, honesty, and preparation. And I think the aha moment sort of is twofold. It comes from, I grew up in a Catholic family that's very focused on what your moral compass is. And I think that makes decision making a lot easier. It also emphasizes a type of environment that you want to create. So for example, one of my aha moments is, for all of us probably at some point in our life, we've seen someone be a bully, whether it's in the workplace or in a personal situation. And very early on, it was crystal clear to me how destructive that sort of leadership style is with regards to both people and teams. And so in some ways that was an aha moment in terms of what didn't emulate, right? And so my focus really has been on creating a supportive environment that allows our employees to really flourish.
Yeah. Thank you, Martha. And Ashley, I'm going to end this question with you. You are now our official Ander sister, so we want to know, what is your style?
Thank you for welcoming me to the club. I appreciate it. That's a pretty heavy question for me. I, like I said, had the opportunity to start my career in television. Started working professionally at CNN at 18, I think. And then I went on to work at CBS and tons of cable networks, and then sort of fell into this reality space where I am now at WeTV. And since I started so young, I started with this leadership style of hustling and grinding really, really hard in pursuit of excellence for everything that I did. And fortunately and unfortunately, around my late 20s, I was diagnosed with a debilitating neurological disorder that completely shut me down. I had to go through months and months of doctors trying to determine what was going on with my health and how I could get back on top. And for me, that time where my body was sort of trying to figure out how to still move in a space where I was still trying to work hard and keep grinding, my mind was telling me to please slow down and reassess how you were going to approach your life. And that included my professional life. During that time, I realized that my leadership style would need to change from a hustler, a grinder, and a hard worker into a teacher and into a mentor and into someone who will boss. Because at that time, as a showrunner, sort of to Ryan's point, when you're in a position where you're leading teams and you're putting out fires, you do get in the habit of doing all the work yourself. But when you can pivot and shift over into a space where you can teach others to do the work that you've been doing, possibly teach them how to do it better, it takes a lot of pressure off of you. And you have the capacity at that point to lend your mind and your spirit into a space of cultivating excellence versus actually creating it by bending over backwards and toiling for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing our newly adopted Anders sister. Thank you. And so I'm going to stick with you, Ashley.
Sure.
It seems the common theme amongst you all is that servant leadership, being compassionate and really caring for your workforce. But just to augment that leadership style, I want to turn to the issue of authenticity and bringing your authentic self to the workplace. So for me, it took a while before I became comfortable in my own skin and who God created me to be. And I'm still on that journey of growth. But as a female and as a female learner, female leader in what's still considered a male-centric industry, how do you show up and revel in your authentic self? Are there limits to bringing her to the workplace? Is there an art to being her as you balance that femininity versus the politics of show business and winning people to your side? I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Ashley.
Sure. I think my vision and stance on that comes from my childhood experience in high school. I went to a predominantly white private school where I was typically the only Black person in the room. And the experiences of being a minority really challenged me to be comfortable in my own skin, because otherwise I would disappear. I would shrink in those circumstances if I didn't really know who I was and I didn't feel confident in it. So it was really in those years where I was groomed to be someone who loved her authentic self. All the femininity, all the Blackness, all the southernness, all the youthfulness. I emboldened in that spirit over the years, and as I got older, I learned how to use it toward any space I was going to walk into. So when it came to television, and I did notice that I was typically in a predominantly white male environment, I was almost excited by the opportunity to introduce them to the me that they hadn't met yet. Going to an historically Black college, Howard University, also invigorated that spirit, and it really taught me how to stand firm in who I am, and all of the flaws and all of the nuances of my personality weren't necessarily things I should be ashamed of, but instead things that I should celebrate and learn how to apply them to everything that I'm doing, because I'm uniquely made, and the things that I bring to the table, no one else can bring. And in doing so, I'm going to make what I'm attached to that much better and that much different. So particularly in the space of storytelling, I learned that in helping other people tell their stories, my story was going to influence how their story could also be authentic, because in me, they would see an authentic and a truthful person being vulnerable and transparent with them, and it would motivate them to do the same. And that part of me is what made the shows that I did, the groups that I was a part of, feel that much greater, because they were real. People, when they meet me, they get permission to be themselves. And as a reality television producer, that's like the most important component you can bring to the table, because you want the real, you want the vulnerability that comes with these stories, so that the viewer can really connect with them and the shows can perform well, because people recognize that these are real things happening that they can invest their emotions in.
Yeah. Introducing people to you. That is an awesome mantra to live by. Martha, I want to turn to you and dig a little deeper into women leading in that male-centric industry and challenge the notion that you're not a leader unless you lead like a man, however they define it, whoever they are. What happens typically those traits that are attributed to men as positive are negatively reflected on women, such as a man can be assertive, whereas a woman is too aggressive. A man could be passionate, but a woman or a Black woman is an emotional or an angry Black woman. Um, how have you used your leadership style, Martha, to overcome the notion of leading like a man and really pushing towards the notion of leading with your strengths?
A couple things. I think fortunately things have evolved over the years. So I think at a 30,000 foot level, there's a different understanding of what a strong leader, what that looks like. And I think we've heard it, frankly, in our business school classes to a certain degree, right? There's been an evolution in the stereotype of what leadership means and what it looks like. And I think that's really beneficial, in particular for women, because the stereotypes are often sort of against women. And I think that coupled with the needs of the modern workplace, so we've gone through a really tumultuous year, not just the pandemic, but the civil unrest. And what I've seen in my own company is that employees, frankly, are looking for leadership qualities that typically are associated with women. So you think about women as being more empathetic, more collaborative, better listeners. These are qualities that are really sort of needed and sought after at this point in time. And I think that demand is only going to grow. So personally, it's been rewarding seeing the environment change. When I was an undergrad at UCLA, one of my roommates got a really prestigious internship at one of the big accounting firms, which she later joined. They still had a dress code for women, which is like unheard of today, but it spoke to, just different standards for women than men in the workplace in a whole variety of ways. And I think we don't see that as much anymore. I think the more we talk about the good and bad aspects of each of these qualities, you talked about emotion. I've been in a meeting where a male executive got really angry about something, started yelling, and kicked a trash can. Now, that person exhibited emotion, but again, it's perceived differently in men than it is in women. So the more we sort of bring this up a little bit and force people to start to really think about it, because as soon as I tell people the story, they're like, yeah, you're right, that is emotion. And so it happens. And so how does that affect our perception of people? I think the more we talk about it, the better off we're going to be.
I absolutely agree. The more we talk
Torrie,
about it, the better off. Yes, go ahead, Ashley.
You just made me think of something, Martha, when you mentioned that, because when I came over to WeTV, this is the first time that I've worked on a staff with predominantly comprised of women. And there is, I think we bring an emotional intelligence to our jobs that a lot of men don't have, not to paint a broad stroke across all men, but generally speaking, there's a way that women communicate that has a certain compassion in it that I think is helpful in team environments where you're allowing people to be heard before jumping to conclusions most of the time. And there is a nurturing spirit that I think a lot of women, not all women and not all men don't have it, but generally speaking, a lot of women have a nurturing spirit where you lose the fear factor that I think is most often associated with corporate environments, where if you fail, that you may be out. And a lot of women, not all women, offer up a safe space to grow. And I think the more women that we have in executive positions, the more we can diversify how we deal with team dynamics and problem solving and multitasking, to be quite honest with you. I had a young girl asked to apply for a position just yesterday and was concerned that she wouldn't be eligible for it because she had taken time off to be a housewife and be with her kids. And I said, well, there are quite a few skills in managing a home and managing the lives of multiple children that are very applicable to this job. So jot them all down and express in your cover letter and in your interview how you think those skills could be very beneficial to the organization. Sorry to interject, but that just came to me as you were
saying. No. This is part of the conversation. That actually leads to our next question. I'm going to turn to Bernetta. Taking into account that story that Ashley just shared, do you think that we are trending towards more equitable parity in gender representation and how women are treated in the workplace?
Thank you for that question. I definitely think we are trending upward. It's returning to a more parity for sure. Just the statistics alone, right? A recent San Diego study showed that 10% of the films in 2019, of top grossing films, were directed by women. And even nowadays, about 45% of like films are all directed by women as well, and about 85% have women as leading characters. And also corporate wise, right? About 45% of women are going to law school, med school, and about 35% are going to get MBAs. So more of us are definitely, I think, taking a lead towards executive positions and taking lead in our careers and leadership positions. There's still issues because, for example, in law, there's about 25% of us going to as partners. So something happens between going to law school and being a partner, which I'm not going to minimize in any type of way. But there is growth because I think when I came out, even 10 years ago, it wasn't 25% women partners. It was more like 10 or 15. So definitely seeing there's growth. And I think the main factors are two factors in entertainment from my perspective is first, there are more programs now. There are more incentives. There's more of an intentional in some aspects to really include women, to really form partnerships, to form mentorship programs. I think that is more, that it's more accepted now. But also part two, I think women consumers are pushing the envelope, frankly. Women consumers are buying products more. They're buying, they're supporting women directed films. So it makes the powers that be say, oh my God, this is a huge market space. We must cater to this market space, and women are the ones who know themselves better. So I think that's the reason. I think that's a huge factor is the women consumers. And so I always encourage women, if you really want to see more women in power, do two things. First of all, when you're in power, succeed, right? You work hard and do the best you can. So for example, Catherine Bigelow winning the Academy Award for Hurt Locker changed the game. You have a woman winning an Academy Award for a military movie, saying women can do more than rom-coms. That changed a lot of our perceptions of women. But also, so do well when you have your opportunity. But part two, use your consumer dollars, use your purchasing power. Go support movies that have women in it. Go support music with women. Go support companies run by women, because that tells the industry, like, look, women leadership is valued. Women have power, purchasing power, and women matter. So I think that is many times more effective in terms of moving the needle than even external forces. It's just really the purchasing power, using that in a more effective way.
It is definitely the purchase. You sure can. I was going to turn to you as well. Absolutely.
Just to talk about one of the external factors that one silver lining, we should say, for this pandemic and this time that we're going through is obviously it's created so much uncertainty on the business landscape, not just in entertainment, but obviously in all industries worldwide. And there's a lot of really interesting data on these moments of crisis being a time when businesses turn to female leadership as well. So even if we hadn't been riding sort of more of this wave and this awareness, the truth is there is actually a lot of data that even at big corporations and firms, females are called in for turnaround jobs. They're called in to clean up messes and things like that. They're called in when they're like really dicey situations because of a lot of the things that we've been talking about. Which obviously women don't run a monopoly on these kinds of attributes, but they certainly have them more than the average male. So just a little bit of a bright spot in a dark pandemic.
It's definitely a bright spot. I want to stay on the topic of the pandemic. It has truly been quite a year for us, for the world. And the entertainment industry and sports industry as well have been hit hard also. Ryann, you lead a creative workforce. So I would love for you to talk about how the pandemic has impacted your operations and the business model of Asylum Entertainment, and the pivots that you've had to make for your company to survive, and including the impact that the pandemic has had on women in the workforce or leaving the workforce because of the pandemic.
It's a great question. I think as far as our business model goes, it's really reinforced for us the importance of equitable partnerships. I think that, it's the business model, it's the pandemic plus the social unrest and, a lot of the social justice issues that we've been looking at have really reinforced our commitment to having equitable partnerships, because at the end of the day, that's really what a lot of the social movement is about. But when we look at it through the lens of the pandemic, I think the truth is when it first hit in March and we moved our company remote about a week before the stay-at-home order happened, we had hoped that we were just doing it for an experiment, but we've been in this experiment for the last year now, obviously, with most other people. when we were able to stabilize that immediately, well, we were lucky in that we had a lot in post-production. So there weren't huge shifts to our production lens right away. And that was just pure coincidence and pure luck. I wish I could say it was really fantastic planning, but we didn't know in 2019 when we got those productions rolling that we'd be hit the way we were in 2020. But what it gave us was an opportunity to sort of do a real process audit. So we did that, and what we're doing now is a real crop of fresh production. And while we felt as prepared as we could have felt going into it, what we really recognized is that entertainment, like most industries, is so human. And the big disruption to our process has been more in how people are able to communicate on set. And we have seen that crop up in so many strange sort of like issues that just come from, wearing a mask and walking around like this and people not being able to say if you're happy with what you just got. If you're not, the kind of like those nonverbal communications have really been disrupted. So what we're doing now is a re-audit based on what we've seen now that we're in the field. So I don't know anything that hasn't been disrupted by COVID from a physical production end. On the post-production end, we've been really lucky. And the other place I think we've been really lucky is that we have been able to be so much more flexible with people who have childcare issues and who have to, have kids at home who they're trying to educate while they're also trying to do work. We have just been super fortunate given, that we can be a little bit more flexible on deadlines, on what hours you're actually working and things like that. But I do know that, anecdotally, probably 20% of the women we generally work with are not working or are taking, different kinds of gigs because they've got, children and someone had to take the role of childcare. And obviously there's been a really uneven burden there.
Yeah, it's definitely been a disproportionate impact on women in the workforce who need to attend to the matters at home for their children or their family, their elderly family members. Ashley, what do you make of this female flight? You just shared with us the story of encouraging someone who dedicated a portion of their lives to taking care of that home to return to the workforce. So what do you make of that female flight from the workforce as a result of COVID?
I think what's happening is all of us are recognizing that there's an opportunity for bonding and sisterhood in this space because we have many more women in executive roles than we did in the past where this isn't the first time in my industry anyway that women have had to sort of take a back seat and go take care of their family instead of working. But I do think this is the first time that it's happening for everyone at the same time. So for many people who, if you do any work with the PGA, there have been conversations for years about, particularly in the unscripted space when women get pregnant and they suddenly can't come back or they can't work during the pregnancy, there are no benefits and that sort of thing. I think now though, because it's happening to so many people at the same time and we have so many powerful women of influence in positions to have the real conversations about how corporations and production companies need to manage this in a more compassionate way, we're benefiting. I think companies like AMC Networks, I think smaller production companies are making real efforts to support women in what decisions they have to make in order to do both. We shouldn't be in a position where we have to choose to take care of our family versus pursuing our career passions. For a lot of executives who've chosen to still work and juggle it all, myself included, I think a lot of these Zoom calls that we have and you see the kids racing by and, your first instinct is to be embarrassed and ashamed. I'm so sorry she's screaming at me from the other side of the room. And the other person on the call is like, it's totally okay. Like, just have her come in. Like, you can bring the baby into the call. And to have women in those conversations and in those exchanges, it really changes the whole environment. You take away the guilt, you take away the embarrassment, and you have real conversations with other real women about, okay, how are we going to do this? I know you have kids at home. I know I have kids at home. We've got 10,000 meetings about $1 million budgets. How are we going to do this? Well, let's put the kids on our phone Zoom and they can talk to each other, or let's sit one kid on the lap and we'll play with them. Like, we figure it out as women and there's an opportunity to bond in that way. And I think that's something that's going to forever change our industry. I think a commercial came out earlier this year where you You saw women behind the scenes of films. They're directing with babies in their arms. They're set dressing with kids following them because they can't leave their kids anywhere during this pandemic. And I think everyone being open and honest about this and not hiding what women are juggling and instead figuring out very smart ways to navigate it is what's going to change things if and when this thing ever ends.
Yeah, it's definitely changed things for the better, for the worse, however you want to look at it. But I think it's also a true testament to the resiliency of our culture, the resiliency of women in particular. So, Bernetta, I want to ask you, how do you see this as a celebration of the culture and of women as we adapt to these new forms of consumption?
I think I piggyback on actually, you are my hero. Actually, I love seeing a lot of my friends are working moms also, and I have a whole new respect. Like I knew it was hard, but I didn't really see it. You know, what I mean? And now I'm like, wow,
I'm
you guys
over
are
here pressing this mute button every 2 seconds because I know she's going to scream. I'm just like,
right, right. But I feel like I agree. I feel like it had this like the authenticity is real now. The realness, like we're really seeing. Look, the past had real unrealistic expectations. This idea that you had to like really hide a huge part of yourself, being a mother, or or being a caretaker, or being a newlywed wife, was really ridiculous in many ways. So I think that COVID and social unrest has really made us push these issues to the brink because it affects, like as she said, across all race, status, everything. It isn't just one class affected. We're all affected by this. So it made us really, I think, really examine our work-life balance, examine what working healthy really is. But also from a creative side, I would say I've seen more examination also regarding the stories that are valuable and in terms of my company and what they push now. Like it used to be like there always was a premium on like the story of the rich WASP family, but now the stories of like the working class family, the minority woman, the Asian American, and by themselves, not with like a white protagonist, but really just by themselves, their culture being intrinsically valuable, I think has really been part of the result of this COVID and social unrest. And I think it's been really positive, just basically our re-examination of our home life balance. Also at my job, we've been examining also our retention in terms of attorneys and really about the fairness of executives. Like why is it there are so many minorities and only execs are only 2 networks as opposed to the other networks? Why are they leaving? Why are minorities not being promoted? So I think this really has pushed companies to really examine everything. And I think it's about time. So to me, it's been a really positive, inspiring, frankly, result.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience, and I believe that it speaks to what you just said, Bernetta. And the question is, what are the 2 most important skills that a male manager needs to be a good coach or mentor to a female direct report or colleague, given the shift that we're experiencing now and that trend towards gender parity? Anyone can chime in on that one. Actually.
I just had this conversation with a colleague earlier this morning. I hate to make it so black or white and cut and dry between males and females, but I do feel like our male colleagues could take a few lessons in patience. I think that oftentimes, like I mentioned, there's an emotional intelligence that a lot of women have that makes many women just more aware of the sensitivities of things and how they're impacting more than just the one thing. Whereas most men that I work with are only dealing with the one thing. But if you allow yourself to be patient and think through all the ramifications of this decision you just made or how you spoke to your female employee and how that might be impacting other parts of her life, you could have a much more candid and honest conversation and actually reach a conclusion or a solution to whatever the problem is in a much more compassionate way. And outside of that, value the relationship. I think a lot of my male colleagues are totally focused on the business at hand versus the exchange that happens between 2 human beings when you're trying to solve an issue. I think this time during the pandemic, when we've all sort of been locked in place, we're having more conversations over Zoom and calls and that sort of thing. And instead of racing through to get to the solution to the problem, enjoy the time that you're spending with this person to talk through it, get to know them and understand who they are and how they're approaching a situation so that they feel heard, because everyone's so isolated right now. that level of communication, that higher level of communication where you're actually allowing people to be full people versus just your employee. You're asking them how their day is. When you hear a noise in the background, you're curious, do you need a moment to deal with that? Like you're being patient with their life and with who they are as a human being versus just working through it to get to the business of things.
Can I
Anyone
add
else
one
want
word?
to chime in? Sure, Martha. I'm going to go to
Just
Martha and
one-
then Bernetta.
Just one more word. I think coupled with patience, the word empathy is really important. And I think as managers, we're all sort of being asked to be more empathetic, which is a little different in that it requires us to be patient, but it also requires us to take the time to really understand what is happening in someone else's life, so that you can take that into account. I think the old days, it was like you just need to take care of whatever's happening home on your own time, figure it out. I think that model no longer works, obviously because of the pandemic, but I think post-pandemic, it's still no longer going to work. And that means that there's going to have to be changes with regard to how people manage and also with regard to what policies are in place to support people.
Bernetta?
Thank you. I would just add to ask and listen versus making assumptions, because I've seen male managers with really good intentions really derail on accident. Like, for example, I've had two of my friends who had babies recently, and but they're fully fine. They can do their jobs. And our manager, one of our bosses, had said, one of these bosses were like, maybe she's too busy with the newborn. I won't give her these deals. And not giving attorneys big deals, it kind of throws you off the path of really getting promoted. So his intention was not to hurt her. It was to say, oh my gosh, she's just a newborn. She probably wants some time. But the impact is that you might derail her career or derail her from getting the next promotion. So I would say, and so of course we were like, she's fine. Or why don't you just ask her about her bandwidth? Ask her before you say no to, giving her this amazing deal that she could probably, do great work and also use this to get promoted. Ask her about her bandwidth. Ask her what she can do. Talk to her about it. And also ask her, what does she need in terms of resources? So I would say just really ask and listen, because I feel, as I said, I've seen a lot of male managers just really do make mistakes from just making assumptions, and they weren't coming from a bad place. But the assumptions were just so devastating, in terms of the women, career path. So just listen and ask, and that would just solve everything. Oh, not everything, but it would be a great
solve everything.
I think that's a great point. I think one of the things I would just encourage people to do, men or women, is when you're walking into a room with other people in it, recognize that your experience is an experience, not the experience, right? Like everyone's coming from different places. And I think that what we're really saying is boiled down to, like, don't make assumptions that whatever, what you need are the needs of other people, or how you would react, how someone else is going to react. So, constantly challenging that what people are experiencing, I think is major for both genders.
I think it may also be helpful for, I was just going to say, I think it may also be helpful for male executives or managers to understand that there's a history here of women feeling like they couldn't speak up or that they couldn't be honest with their male bosses or direct reports. And there may be a benefit to taking some extra time to be sure that people understand that you're approachable and you will listen, and that there can be a more cordial relationship between manager and employee than there may have been in the past.
Yeah, it's all about maintaining your voice and actually using that voice. We have one more question from the audience. Is there a way for women of color to work with undeserved student communities to include both young women and young men? And I'll leave the floor open.
Can you ask it one more time?
Sure. Is there a way for women of color to work with undeserved student communities, including both young women and young men? So how I interpret this as, how can women of color work with undeserved communities to raise them as leaders?
So
Go ahead, Martha.
I'll take a shot at it, and then others, I would love you to join in. I do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. A lot of the organizations are in Los Angeles. There are some really impressive community groups out there serving communities of color that do not have a lot of resources. I'll just throw out a couple. Brotherhood Crusade they're one of the oldest African American established nonprofits in the city, and they do a extraordinary job at cultivating leadership, both in the Black and Brown communities. Community Coalition does a lot of work with high school students, same communities, teaching them to sort of empower themselves and be sort of the future leaders. So those are just a couple of ideas, but I think in every community, there's really great organizations that already have a foundation for doing this work that you can plug into in terms of your skill set.
I think plugging into infrastructure makes a ton of sense. I think a lot of times people get like really, they're so moved by what they see around that they want to start new initiatives. But the truth is there's so many initiatives that really need more support and help that are really quite good. Entertainment specifically has a lot of really interesting initiatives. I know the ones in the non-scripted space better than the scripted space, but good friend of mine, Ricardo Handy, just started the Handy Foundation, really based on assistant editors and editors of color getting more opportunities. And so what I would say to people of color, women of color who are at entertainment companies in particular, and who are hiring managers or who oversee hiring managers, making sure that you plug into those groups to give people who otherwise may not get the same sort of shot, an opportunity to come in at those sort of entry level positions, I think is really important, because more often than not, you have those entry level positions are given to like your friends, or like, the C-suite's friend has there's a son of some person, and now that person kind of comes back in, and that's great. But not everybody has parents who have those sorts of connections. So just being mindful of that.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to add into that one?
Something. I was going to mention something.
Go ahead. Uh-oh, looks like we're losing her feed.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, I mentioned something similar. I have a nonprofit in Harlem for young teen girls. And I try to just introduce them or have them as many women in the industry as possible. And I think that's very important. A lot of times it really is just about young girls of color seeing women doing what they want to do, or a lot of young girls aren't even aware of what the possibilities are. So I just try to introduce them to a wide variety of options and career paths that women have taken. So women of color who are in these positions seek out organizations where you can just show up and be seen. So some young girl can witness that you exist and possibly aspire to be like you. The other thing I was going to mention also was about the pipeline and the networking issue that a lot of entertainment corporations and production companies have, in that we could all do better with bringing in more young people of color and exposing them to the environment. Showing them the ropes, creating disciples, if you will, to come in and move in and infiltrate the system, so that we no longer have to have situations where apparently no one can find Black talent, because we help bring them in. They're there. They're right in front of you.
They are right in front of you. Well, ladies, I want to thank you so much for your time. I do want to end on one note. What is one word you would use to describe your legacy? Ashley.
Truth.
Ryann.
Hyphenated, in progress.
Martha.
Brave.
And Bernetta.
Fair.
Thank you, ladies. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, our Pulse audience, for joining us, and we look forward to having you and seeing you next year. Thank you so much.